There's definitely a difference between the crossovers and the way that you wrote them and the way that the other crossovers turned out. And
Mm.
because like you said, all titles had some kind of tie-in, but in my opinion, most, if not all, were very loose. If not, almost it didn't feel like there was the stories were going on, and yes, you had the Red Skies, but there was no really concerted effort. And I mean this with no critical eye, just being observational. But when I was reading that, the interesting thing about it was how you were able to merge and move around the story.
Mm.
As I hadn't read Crisis. I read your stories first, but the way that you took it, it seemed real, and the continuity was advancing itself in a real way. And I think Roy Thomas did something similar with All Star Squadron, and I think it's you and him. All the other crossovers were more like spin-offs. And it was really interesting how you took care of that continuity. And you said maybe it doesn't work because they are revamping it, but at that time, you're right. I think those stories are special because they feel that they have a self-referential or a referential sequence.
Yeah, I like that stuff. But again, that was the first, pretty sure Crisis was the first company-wide thing that either company had done. And they wanted to keep a light touch. I can say later, just a couple of years later, when I did Millennium with Joe Staten, our idea was every series in the DC universe, one of their characters is actually a Manhunter,
Yep,
which is right, because they can disguise themselves and so forth. I would also just passingly mention Secret Invasion at Marvel pretty much, took that idea and turned it into a Marvel thing, and now it's on TV.
right.
But this, that was our idea to have everybody, and so we said it can be a third-rate character. It doesn't matter. We're not trying to get in your way, all you other writers. Just pick somebody who you can get rid of and make him the Manhunter or her the Manhunter. And I found, and that was more of an ask than Turn the Skies Red, right? But I found that there were people who thought, okay, that's what we're doing this summer. That's I'll do that. But there were some people who said, I don't want to do that, and had to be talked to
Oh,
about
wow.
it. People were, and not by me, but I mean by editorial. So everybody's writing his own series, and for anybody to come in and say, well, put this thing in there too.
Right.
I understand that's an imposition, right? I tried to
Right.
make it as easy an imposition as possible, but and so I think most people during the Crisis and during Millennium and probably during any of these things now sort of does what they're asked, and that's it. They don't try to participate in a sense.
Wow. But it's interesting. You hark back to a tradition of collaborative creation between artists. Going back to the surrealists, right? It's like that's
Right,
what the Exquisite Corpses, right?
right.
You would begin so, and that was done a lot. I would say at that time. In some, what was that series? DC had a series where one set of creative team would begin, and then another one would come up and pick up the story. I don't remember the title.
Yeah, I don't either, but
Yeah.
yeah.
So
Um,
what's different now, Steve? Is that something that's a little bit harder? I don't see it. I mean, I don't see it nowadays, in the way that it was back in the 80s, 70s.
no, it's not. Well, I'm not in comics anymore, basically for that reason. When I was doing it in the 70s and the 80s, I basically had complete freedom to do what I wanted to do. And out of that came the stories that came out of it, which people seem to like, right?
Yes.
Um, but it's sort of inevitable that as the companies got bigger, then you got people who needed to justify their position, and needed to show that they had they were involved and so on and so forth. And so you started getting more editorial oversight. And I mean, beyond that, what with the movies? I mean, when I was given Captain America, or when I was given Green Lantern, I was told I could do anything I wanted to do.
Mm,
So I did. Now, if I was given Green Lantern or Captain America today, there would be several editorial levels. There would be the merchandising guy. There would be the movie studio guy. There would be, all these people are now ringing around the creator, and
wow.
you have to, you have. So if you were doing comics today, if I were doing comics today, I would not get creative freedom, and I would
Right.
have to like run it past all these different people who could step in doing what I just talked about with the
Wow.
crises. They could step in and go, well, add a red sky, you know, okay, well, or don't do Supergirl because she's, or whatever.
Right.
All these things that were not part of what I had to worry about, right? So I understand why it's like that now, because
Right.
basically the movies are running the place. The printed material is no longer the driving force for any of this stuff. Um, so we were just in a different era. I mean,
Yeah.
and lucky to be so.
Well, yeah, absolutely. I mean, like you mentioned earlier, definitely a golden era, but also for us who were reading the material, and there's a special, and this is I go to comic book shops and talk to a lot of people, and we all agree with this. And I do believe that some of the stories, at least what I see on TV and on the movies, they're harking back to those mythologies, to the
Yeah,
ones that you guys built, and not necessarily the thing that came out in the 2000s. And I don't even see people proposing storylines that were good from the early 90s, like Armageddon 2001, or,
mhm.
some other ones. People go back to the 70s, 80s, 60s, and even 50s. And I feel that's not going to stop. So, we, the people that grew up reading that, we are, I guess, our responsibility is to show the new generations like how much we love what you guys created, and share it, celebrate it, and maybe people will go back. And it's the only way I think that studios and the powers that be will kind of recognize maybe how important it is to have creative freedom, and to allow some leeway into some of the story building, right?
That would be nice. I'm not sure that the structure can allow that. I'm not
Right.
sure how all those guys could be persuaded to just sit back and let the creator create, but it would be nice if so. But it is interesting that this stuff from 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, 80s, whatever, but it stays in print, right? I
Yes.
mean, and it stays in print because people do still value it. I get letters all the time from people who have just discovered it for the first time, right?
Right.
Um, but also from people who read it 50 years ago and are now rereading it. I mean, so it just was it was a. I mean, it's called the Bronze Age, but to me, it was the golden age of comics. I think the 40s get the name Golden Age because that was the beginning, etc. But I think the best comics probably were in the Bronze Age. That's
Yeah.
my biased opinion, but I just know not only did I enjoy doing it, but I enjoyed reading what everybody else was doing at the same time, right?
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
so I think that comes through. I mean, I still, and as you say, that is the stuff that they draw on pretty much.
Yeah,
Um,
and it does come true. And I have to mention DC Comics presents, love Swamp Thing, Salmon Grundy. That was one of my, I guess, favorite titles, and I love what was done back in the time. Well, I guess, tell me what you're doing right now. Any last words that you want to give to the community? that are actually revisiting these stories for the first time, any type of primer, like what should they be reading first, or any storylines that you think are worth looking to, so I can cover it or they can look at it, we would truly appreciate it.
Well, I don't have anything specific to point to. People ask me what was my favorite character, and I say all of them, which is totally true, because I just had such a good time. Every time I got a new character, I got to play with a new set of toys, right? And I tried to play as hard as I could, right? So
Right.
I just,
You gave us Guy Gardner.
I did. Yes, I did. Me and Joe Staten.
Yes.
Staten points out, by the way, that he was the first Green Lantern who didn't wear a costume that was just the Green Lantern costume, right?
Right.
I mean, we really made Guy Gardner a special character and had a good time with him.
Right.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm still writing because I like to write, but I'm not really writing for deadline anymore. I'm not writing with the idea that, like, oh, I have to get this done by Thursday. So I'm actually producing stuff, but I'm sort of producing stuff for my own amusement. I mean, things, I'll tell you this, we can wrap it up with this, but I always wanted to do a story about a town with a whole bunch of ongoing characters, and two of those characters become superheroes, but I don't tell you which two they are. And so you've got this group of people, all of whom have their own stories, and two of them have secret stories that I'm not telling you, at least in the beginning. And I really wanted to see if I could do that. If I could tell a story with 20 ongoing storylines that all had to like mesh and zoom and not all come to a climax at the same time. Anyway, came this pandemic you might have heard about, and I had a lot of free time, so I tried that, and eventually I did. I got exactly what I wanted, and it was only then that I said, this has come out to be 7 60-page graphic albums, this story, and there's no artist in the world who's ever going to draw that.
Why?
420 pages.
That's
George Perez,
magnum opus. That's like a Gravity's Rainbow.
Well, I mean, George Perez on his best day probably didn't want to draw 420 pages with 20, 25 characters, etc. It was completely a writer's thing. I mean, I understand comics, obviously, but it wasn't. I didn't think about that. So that's kind of the deal, that I'm writing things that interest me as a writer. And if I can find an artist, and I have other stuff too, but I mean, if I find an artist and who wants to do it, and a publisher wants to publish it, then cool. And otherwise, I write by nature,
I hope some viewers can come forward. If there's any artist out there, a young artist, or want to work with a living legend, well, hopefully this broadcast will reach somebody and something will come out of it. But again, thank you so much, Steve, for your time. I'm gonna wrap up the video, but I'll stay with you for a second, so maybe we'll get to talk again. Thank you so much. Let me see where. Okay.